welcome to episode 2 of Give Me the Remote, the podcast where we watch stuff and let you know if it's worth you watching it too. I'm John. I'm joined, as is our habit, with Sheridan.
Hi, how you going?
And what are we talking about first, Sheridan?
We're talking about The Post.
The Post. So this is Steven Spielberg's lavish, opulent, Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks look at the... That's the sound of a dog shaking itself. The Washington Post during the period where it published the Pentagon Papers.
Do you want to explain what the Pentagon Papers are?
So the Vietnam War is raging, and Robert McNamara, who himself his movie The Fog of War is well worth checking out. Well, it's a documentary about him. Has commissioned a series of papers with an eye to posterity. It was a really interesting thing that he did, where he got a whole bunch of university academics to go through the interior of the US government, figuring out how they'd gotten to Vietnam and why, and it was pretty damning stuff, and then people started leaking it to the press, particularly to the New York Times at first, and then the New York Times was being injuncted in ways that had never happened in US history to stop them publishing it, and then the Washington Post gets hold of it, and then this is the story of whether or not they publish it or not, and how they deal with that.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about this is, at the time, this was one of the biggest moments in the war between the US government, or executive government, and the press, which had never really happened in such strong terms before. But
highly debatable.
It was a very significant moment.
In modern history, it's probably the most significant moment.
Yeah, you're right, modern history.
The issue is mostly that people who can afford mainstream publishing companies are, by modern standards, billionaires, and billionaires' interests normally align with their governments.
Yeah. So, I mean, a little bit of the problem with this film is that you kind of look at what's happening today with the press and the attack from the executive on the press, and it doesn't really actually seem that significant, but it was at the time. And I think actually you really do realise watching this film that this is actually an event from history from not even the recent past anymore. This is the distant past. Media operates in a completely different way in this film. Everything is just so different to what it is today, and it's actually like a history lesson. Yes,
yeah, I see what you're saying with that. I mean, to declare my biases, I spent 20 years working as a journalist, so there are people who question that, but every journalist will have people who question their credential. And as a journalist, there are two great defining moments of the modern free press. One is the Pentagon Papers Watergate era, and at the end of the film they do feed into the fact that Watergate's just about to happen.
They do.
And the other one is the New York Times during the draft riots in New York in the US Civil War, when the editor of the New York Times hosed down an angry crowd of draft rioters with a machine gun. Which every editor in the world really wishes he could do with people who disagree with his editorial line. Or she, I hasten to add.
There is this great scene, though, when they go to publish the story about the Pentagon Papers, and they've made the decision to do it, and they show the journalists typing it up with their typewriter, it going to the printer, and then putting it in...
Setting the type.
Mm-hmm. The actual printing press is working in their quite sort of, old school machinery. Them coming
impressive
off.
Machinery.
That is impressive, but it's not very automated. It's not that automated. They come off the machines, and there's men physically carrying these papers into trucks, and then off the trucks and onto the sidewalk, and then people going and handing over their dime or whatever and buying this paper. And that is just so far away to how we consume news now.
Oh, it is. And there's also things like the Attorney General of the United States calls up the editor and says, I would like to ask that you make no further publications on this, because at this era the horse is bolted. Whereas today they'd say, I want you to take that story down off the website. Exactly. Yeah. And trust me, people will call all day long wanting stories taken down off the website. There is a very old adage in journalism, I believe it was Lord Acton, one of the great editors of the Times, who said, journalism is what someone somewhere doesn't want printed. everything else is advertising. And most news you get these days is advertising. There's very little news that someone somewhere doesn't want printed, but that doesn't mean that anything's gotten better.
The performances, what did you think of the performances?
I did not like a single character in this whole movie. Everyone was vile and foul and terrible. And I've been thinking hard about this. I've got a real problem with Tom Hanks' depiction of the editor of the Washington Post.
Well, you would be way more qualified to talk about Benjamin Bradley as a character and whether that was a true portrayal of that character.
Yeah, there's one thing, having spent a lot of time in newsrooms, albeit much smaller newsrooms than the Washington Post in the 1970s, I will grant you, it's always a very parental role between the editor and the rest of the newsroom. And I can tell you, almost every popular culture movie depiction of an editor, there is that parental thing comes through. And I can tell you that they do that because it's accurate. Because that every editor feels that parental.
You didn't think that was the way that was.
No, he didn't appear to give a damn about any of the people who worked for him.
I think but the relationship that's being portrayed is actually more between him and Catherine Graham, who's the publisher.
Yep.
That is what essentially this movie's about, and Catherine Graham, for people that don't know, was the first woman to be a publisher of a major US newspaper. She inherited it from her father passed the newspaper down to her husband, and he committed suicide, and it moved to her. And Meryl Streep, how can you really ever fault Meryl Streep? But I struggled with this movie to find whether she was just really accurately portraying
I didn't think there was
character.
anywhere near enough steel. I thought there was no way this woman was as simpering as
she kind of swaps between, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not qualified to hard ass, get the job done, I'm the boss.
I thought there wasn't enough hard ass. And in particular, the publisher-editor relationship. I have never known an editor anywhere who would talk to their publisher the way this Tom Hanks character...
Yeah, but maybe they would when it's the first female publisher.
I just don't believe... I didn't find it credible.
I think the problem was actually the...
And I have been in that editor role, and I've definitely told publishers where to get off, and I've definitely told publishers I was not going to do what they wanted. I would never have done it the way he was doing it.
There are some interesting portrayals about the way sexual politics would have played out for her as a woman at that time. For example, you're constantly seeing Catherine Graham having to host these parties while she's in the middle of trying to make these extremely difficult, complex decisions about publicly listing her company and making these very significant editorial decisions, but she has to go out and give these sort of speeches to all her political friends, because as a woman, that was your role back then, is to be the socialite.
The hostess.
And the hostess. And she has to kind of balance these two competing interests, and that I found to be quite interesting. But I think the writing kind of let it down a little in that there was just sort of like no nuance in between that and then her as a actual businesswoman and struggling to...
I felt she didn't portray the character as someone I would either like to know or like to spend time with or like to work for. The character as portrayed by Meryl Streep, and I can't think of a finer actress in the world, in the world. But in this case, she brought nothing to the party that I found pleasant.
Where's some amazing caftans at parties though? She was rocking those caftans.
Yeah. I feel that's a poor qualification. So, if you're unfamiliar with the history, maybe watch it.
I think it's actually a nice history lesson. Like, I probably wouldn't remember it. I didn't actually really probably know a lot about the that I knew about the Pentagon Papers, but I didn't know a lot about the decisions to publish them and how controversial that was at the time. So I think it's actually like, if you want to have a history lesson, take 2 hours out of your life and you'll be better for it. But it's not something you'd rewatch again, or even probably necessarily tell your friends, rush out and watch this.
Yeah, I think it's literally so far down my list that not only will I never watch it again, ever. Like, if someone's got it on in the house, I'll just go to another room.
Yeah.
and that's a pretty damning indictment.
I'm not sure I would go to another room, but Steven Spielberg's an amazing filmmaker. He
is, but it's just, and this is stuff that's very dear to my heart personally. And the depiction of it is alienating. I mean, it's just mumbly dialogue for what feels like hour after hour as well.
Yeah.
No one ever seems particularly interested in the stakes. Everyone's still having garden parties. The depiction of Robert McNamara and his relationship with Graham is probably the single most interesting scene in the movie, and where there's a sense of any sort of conflict or stakes as well. And that's McNamara worried that she doesn't realise what a vindictive bastard Nixon is. And I would say if you want to see McNamara, watch The Fog of War, which won an Academy Award in its year as Best Documentary, and is Robert McNamara, in his own words, admittedly at the very end of his life, but still driving his Ford because he ran Ford for many years. And yeah, he's an interesting dude. He killed a lot of people. He thinks he saved more lives than he killed, and he thinks that means something. But yeah, if you want to see a depiction of Robert McNamara, that's the one to see. Not necessarily this, although even the ghost of McNamara still gave the most lively scene in the whole movie. So, The Post, well written, well spoken, a movie for boring, sensible people who've lost all sense of life, I feel.
Oh, well, I'm not going to be that harsh on it. I think I would give it 3 stars.
3.
I think there wasn't really a moment where I was bored, as Spielberg does, very good at pacing a movie. I mean, it's a complicated story. The Pentagon Papers of themselves now probably aren't actually that exciting, the way that the story unfolds. Like, it was he kind of keeps you engaged in that throughout
I think the other thing with the Pentagon Papers, is that everyone already knew, particularly after the Tate Offensive, that it was all a lie. Everyone had already hauled that in. There was a sense of general revolt in the country. Although it's worth noting Nixon did win re-election after the events depicted in this. So it gives a sense that the whole country was seething and wanting change, and then they re-elected Nixon. So the orneriness of Red State America is probably a subject for a podcast all its own, and probably not by us. But I guess it asks some questions. And if you haven't seen it and you've got nothing else to do and you're interested in the history but don't know that much about it yet, which is really starting to narrow down the niche of the audience.
So how many stars?
2 from me.
2.
And those are technical stars. It's a Spielberg movie. It's well shot. It's got some good stuff going on, but it's had a lot of media stuff. It wasn't lovely because there's nothing media likes as much as a story about a newsroom.
That's true.
Oh, look, that could be me. All right, we're gonna cut now, and we'll come back with the next segment. And next we have
Tonya.
Now, this is Margot Robbie, who we love because she's Australian, and all Australians must support all other Australians at all times. It's the rules, right?
Well, I've actually got to be honest. I didn't actually really think much of Margot Robbie until this movie.
You honestly thought she was not Australian as well, right?
I knew she was Australian, but I just didn't think too much of her.
Mm-hmm.
But I really changed my opinion after this film. She's amazing as Tonya Harding. I think she puts in a really good performance. Really gives some sympathy to the character, who is pretty much at one point in time the most hated woman in America.
I think having become the most hated woman in America made her inherently sympathetic as well.
Maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, definitely, one thing they make clear throughout this, it's, what do we call it, a faux documentary?
Yeah, it's a faux documentary, yeah.
And
a mockumentary.
Is it a mockumentary, though? Because I didn't think it was that big on the comedy.
Oh, I didn't realise you needed comedy for a mockumentary.
I thought there needed to be mockery. As
film podcasters, we need to brush up on our terms, obviously.
Some of us do. Look, the inner journalist cries out at the faux documentary because it's the interviews you couldn't get.
But they say that they're based on interviews that they did get.
Well, why didn't they show us the video of that then?
Well, because Margot Robbie's a bit more attractive than Tonya Harding, and definitely Sebastian Stan as Jeff Gilhooly is way more attractive than real Jeff Gilhooly.
This is another movie where there's not a likeable character to be seen.
No, that's true, but I mean,
literally everyone's horrible. Her coach is horrible. Her mother is vile. Her boyfriend is terrible. Her boyfriend's mate is worse. Everyone involved in ice skating is a terrible snob. Is there a single nice, decent character? Even Nancy Kerrigan comes across as a bit of a bitch.
True. She doesn't have a lot of airtime in this movie, though, admittedly. Like, this is actually a movie that's about Tonya Harding. And when I was a teenager, I was quite obsessed with this story. I mean, it was like
didn't Australian media not do a very good job of showing the nuance of the story?
Well, that's what you realise watching this film. I don't know how accurate it is historically, but there is definitely a lot more to it than what was portrayed at the time. So it does definitely appear that Tonya Harding really didn't understand what Jeff and his bunch of goons were actually going to do to Nancy.
I don't think Jeff and his bunch of goons even understood what they were planning to do to Nancy. I think that it's reasonably clear from his history and the way they showed in the movie that it was all a bit of a cock-up by idiots.
Yes. And I mean, that actually seems to be... This movie is trying to say that Tonya Harding's life has just been pretty much a cock-up by idiots. I mean, she is surrounded through her life by horrible people that just fail her constantly. And all she wanted to do was skate.
Yeah, now, the decision to get with Jeff and to stay with Jeff, because most of the horrible cock-ups in her life are Jeff-related.
But she does get with Jeff to escape her abusive mother.
Yeah, but you don't have to hook up with a Jeff to escape your abusive mother.
Maybe you do when you're a poor waitress who is trying desperately to better herself through skating, which is an extremely expensive
it's not like Jeff was a major
sport.
upgrade.
Well, yeah, but I mean, her options would have been limited.
Yeah, but she was a very attractive woman and a very talented ice skater.
We have different views about whether Tonya Harding was attractive.
Well, she gets played by Margot Robbie. There's a good start.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's not the first time that's happened.
I remember these events reasonably well for all that they were a long time ago. There was no one going around saying, wow, Tonya Harding, a bit ugly for an ice skater.
Well, that's actually untrue, because that was actually what everyone was saying about her, was that she lacked the grace on the skating rink that all of the other skaters had.
But that was just snobs talking about, does she look like a little princess? I mean, she still looked like an attractive woman.
Well, yeah, I guess so, but she had more of a... She focused in her skating more on the physicality of getting
the triple axel, which they go on and on and on about the triple axel.
Well, because that was at the time pretty amazing. She was the first US female skater to land a triple axel in competition. I believe
it's still a very small number who can do it as well.
Yeah, I know, and she was just focused on that with dogged determination, and that takes quite a lot of athletic ability, and so that's what she focused on, not so much the presentation and... I mean, I don't know anything about ice skating. I imagine your hands have to go in little prissy positions, but, none of that other stuff. She was just all about landing the good tricks.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the mockumentary, they have scenes when the judges say, well, we don't care if you were better, you just didn't look what we want you to look. Or, I mean, the ZZ Top scene is, it's great to hear ZZ Top again. There's a band that's kind of disappeared.
It was good.
So, that was nice. One thing that is striking, just in the end, it's one of those films that's worth watching the end credits for, because they actually show, finally, a lot of the real Tonya Harding ice skating.
And she...
was electric.
She's amazing.
Yeah. And there's nothing they can do with trying to jazz up Margot Robbie and put body doubles in and trick film. The thing does not compare in the slightest to the real footage of the real Tonya Harding skating her guts out at her best.
Yeah, it's just very powerful.
It was night and day.
Yeah.
Which is almost makes me like, what again? Why can't we just watch the real thing? Why are we watching this selective recreation of events? And that's where I start to struggle with it. But as a as a $6.99 Apple Movies rental to pass an evening and relive a bit of history and get some new perspectives on things. I guess I liked it for that.
I found it really enjoyable. I found that this was one of those films that really makes you think about this whole myth of the American dream, that if you just work really hard, and which is what Tonya Harding did, and she, in the end, everyone turned against her, and she did make some really bad decisions, but she was living a pretty crappy life. Like, she was quite poor, she was in a very, very abusive relationship, she had a very abusive mother. She probably really never had anyone that genuinely loved her unconditionally without failing her, and for this period of time, the public loved her because she was this amazing skater who landed this triple axel, and then they turned against her so quickly, and no one really listened to her side of the story, and her punishment ultimately was way worse than any of the people that actually assaulted Nancy Kerrigan.
Well, there was that heart-rending scene at the end when the judge is handing down her sentence, which is no custodial sentence, but a lifetime ban from any involvement in skating.
Yeah. So she can't coach, she can't do anything.
Yeah, and she burst into tears saying, for God's sake, just send me to prison for a couple of years, but let me have the rest of my life.
Absolutely tragic.
And then she ends up in women's boxing, which is basically one step up from doing porn.
Yeah, and it was
and
actually,
probably not even that much of a step, even, frankly, but just so people could see her get her teeth knocked out.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting movie about how class and being a woman in society that comes from a poor background, that you're constantly fighting to overcome what's oppressing you. That got deep, didn't it?
I'm not sure a man's journey would be a lot better in those circumstances, although the cattiness of the women's ice skating system probably wouldn't be as bad for a bloke. But yeah. Anything else you want to say on this one?
I mean, I don't think I can give it my first 5 stars, but I'm going to give it 4. This, to me, was a movie that I would tell people to watch. I found it really enjoyable. It was a different take on a moment in history that I felt like I lived through. All of the acting is perfect. And actually, there's some quite funny moments in it, which is, given the heaviness of the subject matter.
Well, it was well done in that sense that it dragged through a lot of dark places with light feet.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it my normal non-committal 4 stars, I guess. I did enjoy watching it. I probably would be willing to watch it again.
Yeah, I'd watch it again.
Yeah. Okay, and what's next? Okay, and for the very first guest reviewer for the Give Me the Remote podcast, we've got Bill Bradley of the Triple M Network, so bit of a exclusive get for us here. Bill, welcome to the show.
Oh, John, thank you for that very kind introduction. You are too kind.
Okay, and now you've been allowed to nominate what show you want to talk about for this segment. What have we got?
So I really got into a show recently on Netflix called The Defiant Ones. And I didn't know anything about it, but I saw obviously who was in it. And that got me initially, so obviously being a big music head, I love watching music docos and all of that. But I knew who Jimmy Iovine was as the owner of Interscope, and he was a big producer with Bruce Springsteen and U2 and all of that. And then obviously Dr. Dre, from sort of the other side of the equation, who was a hip-hop artist with NWA and then turned into a business person. So did Jimmy Iovine, went from producer to more business person, and then these two met and formed this company, which they sold to Apple for $3 billion. So when you read that as a storyline, you sort of go, oh, okay, I think I'll press play. And it's amazing.
Okay, cool.
One thing I found really interesting about this is that Alan Hughes directed it. So I think people have to know that going in, because this is not an impartial view of all these people, because Hughes, who people might remember from Menace to Society, Dead Presidents, has known Dr. Dre for years and years. I don't know what his relationship was like with Jimmy, but it's not exactly a completely impartial viewpoint of Dr. Dre and that whole scene.
It's a very, I found, positive spin on a lot of events. Even when Dre's trying to explain about the time he beat up a female journalist.
Which, I have to say, I've got to give them some little bit of credit for putting that in there. when there's this movie Straight Outta Compton that came out a couple of years ago. It was a lot of criticism about how there was no discussion about the abuse towards women that was occurring in that scene. And so there was a very famous incident where Dre smacked MTV music host.
Oh, she was a Fox host, actually. But,
you're right.
It was a cable
hip-hop show in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Hit It Up, or whatever it was called? Something like that?
Yeah, it was something like that. I
I don't
remember.
quite know what I
don't
was
think we
doing on
got it
Fox
here.
anyway, but obviously Fox is a
In
big
America.
network. Yeah.
But also the history. Like, you're seeing the history of all this music and all these groups, like Tupac, Dr. Dre, obviously Bruce Springsteen, and all of this. So you're getting a musical journey from their history. And that was fascinating. Because, I mean, who's had careers like that? Like,
It's
you know what I
amazing.
mean?
Yeah.
Like, to go from basically nothing to then turn into, one of the biggest artists, business people in the world. I
And
mean, you
Dre's
couldn't
so
write it.
good at recognising rappers with
Oh,
unique style.
Eminem. He discovered Eminem.
Eazy-E, Kendrick Lamar recently.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I did love. There's a scene where it was Jimmy Iovine's intern who first spotted Eminem. Apparently,
That's right.
And I was thinking
That's
that was
true.
a pretty interesting company where the intern can, just go to a band and go see the CEO the next day and say, "Hey, here's a tape you should listen to," and then he can throw it at Dre and say, "What do you think?" And Dre can drag Eminem off the streets of Detroit into his studio.
But did you see that? Do you remember that part where they're sitting in the car tuning the speakers in the car? Do you remember that part?
Yeah.
And so what you're seeing there is how they hear things. So you can imagine when they were working with the artists they did and all that. Because you just keep hearing, Dr. Dre's got the best ear I've ever seen in my life. Like, even Jimmy said, that's better than mine. And he used to own a record label. So there must be more than just being a good listener. There's more to it than that.
There was something they touched on in the show which I thought was really interesting as well, where Dre says, I come from the West Coast, everyone gets around in cars, everyone who's into hip-hop has got subwoofers in their car. So he was engineering the sound from the ground up, not to be played on some average Toyota Camry, sound system. He was saying the people who want to listen to this music are going to be listening with big stacked subwoofers, and we're going to make sure the sound engineering is geared up right from the start to sound fantastic on those kind of rigs. And then everyone's hearing their music as they're going down the street and they're advertising them.
That's right.
And that kind of getting the third parties to advertise your product really comes out when they get every celebrity in the world to wear Beats and turn the company into a $3 billion brand.
I mean, I looked at that and I thought, that's just a guy. And you remember that line he uses about the blinders? It's like nothing was going to get in these dudes' way of making this happen. Like, not even that stupid video he put up on Facebook that they thought blew the deal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it was like, man, it was a crazy time too. Like, it was a different world back then when this was all happening.
There's a lot of beautiful scenes in this show as well. They do really well in picking the eyes out of broadcast news television and making it look unbelievably racist.
Oh, look,
And I think it looks that racist because it was that racist.
But, you could also argue that NWA thrived on that hate at the time, right?
Oh,
so
definitely.
you know what I mean? Like, the songs they were writing, and obviously I won't use the wording, but F the police,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, they're
But that was
feeding
a
off
song. That
Yeah.
was a song that was actually pretty reasonable social commentary with an incendiary title that was intended to light fires.
Oh, yeah. Like, I mean, it had a specific purpose. You know, like, it wasn't going to people go, you know what, that's a really good beat. I like what they do. You know what I mean? It was going to always be like, okay, who said that?
They did have good beats though as well.
They did.
Yeah.
From
That's
Dre.
Dre's thing.
That's Dre's thing, you know?
It was the perfect combination.
But, someone like Jimmy Iovine, I mean, that's the guy you would want on your side. Like, if I was a band or whatever, I want Jimmy around.
Yeah, but
Like,
that's what everyone, from Lady Gaga to Trent Reznor to Eminem, said, I want to be on Jimmy's label.
Wasn't he a real prick, Trent Reznor? Like, can you imagine working with him? I like his music. Like, I like 9 Inch Nails. But, like, what a dick.
It was actually pretty
Do
smart.
you like 9 Inch Nails' first 2 albums that got
The
released?
Downward Spiral.
Downward Spiral and Pretty Hate Machine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you like all the other stuff since then?
What stuff?
Yeah.
Well,
So it's been a long time since Trent did anything you put on the stereo, though.
yeah, well, that's actually not true because he produces a lot of other music.
Yes, there is that.
For
And
other
he's an
people.
executive in Apple now, buried deep in the bowels of Apple Music.
Well, that was pretty
Yeah.
smart how Jimmy Iovine set him up that way. He recognised this guy actually can't really work with a regular record label.
That's right.
He's too disruptive. I know, I'll pull him onto mine and just say, you can do whatever you want. and gave him a lot of license to do that, and it was really successful, and that was pretty
That was
smart
part of the
move.
agreement, wasn't it? Like he said, I can go and sign artists without asking you.
Yeah.
So we got Marilyn Manson. So obviously, there's lots of other ones, but you got Manson, and then when you got Manson, it was a hit. They just kept winning. Like they kept having success.
Yeah.
With every artist, like it didn't fail. Eminem, then Marilyn Manson. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they came along at a time where it was so intense, like right when Tupac got shot, and then you learn about that, which was cool. You know, like how that all sort of came to be. And
I think again that we did get a pretty one-sided view of those rap wars.
There's been so much commentary.
I mean,
on
they're
those
a
rap
very
wars,
complicated issue. You could do a 20-hour documentary trying to get into the weeds of who
And
did
there
what
have
to
been
do. And
number of documentaries and books written about it, and it still is one of, I mean, the whole involvement of Suge Knight, there's so many rumours about the
he seemed like a really nice fellow once you get to know.
he did though. He was a stand-up guy who stood by Dre and Ivan when it mattered. So
And he was a stand-up guy because he was 7'8".
Yeah, well,
And he was big and
He was
intimidating,
massive.
you know?
yeah. I think I'd like Suge to be on my side in the crisis
Yeah.
too. You know?
But
Possibly because he'd whack the opposition, but
yeah, well, he didn't really learn his lesson very well, did he? But it's just you just learnt so much. I mean, if you didn't know anything about Interscope or Beats headphones or
Interscope
whatever,
was a revelation to me, to be honest. I knew all of the artists they were talking about. I mean, yeah, Nine Inch Nails is one of those classic ones that your average member of the public might not know a lot about Nine Inch Nails, but you ask any musician and they'll come up as an influence. Obviously not every musician. A lot of people don't like Nine Inch Nails at all.
It's
but
exactly the same as Tool fans. People love Tool, right?
Yeah.
But they're not, because they're not a mainstream rock band, everyone's fascinated with them. Can you imagine, and again, without going off on a tangent, but if a band takes 14 years to put out a release, I've moved on, brother.
Yeah.
Like, I'm out. I'm sorry. You had 14 years to impress me. Like, I found someone else. I'm sorry. It's not you, it's me. But at the same time, people stick with them and they want it more. It's insane. The new album's about to come out and people are, like, frothing at the mouth after this wait.
It's going to disappoint though, isn't it?
I don't think it will.
Nothing.
Nah, man. They never
Nothing
let us
can
down.
ever build up that much expectation.
Anyway,
and
we'll talk
deliver.
about that next when we talk about Tool. But no, to get back to it, like I love learning new stuff like that, particularly about a subject I love as much as music. Like to learn that much in just 80 minutes or whatever
Well,
it
it's
is.
4 1-hour episodes.
Oh, sorry, for 4 hours. Yeah, so 4 hours.
So there's a lot in there. A moment that really struck me was when Interscope Records starts attracting a lot of attention because all its artists are angry and saying things about society that society doesn't want to hear, particularly from black people. And they
Never seen that storyline before.
Yeah.
Where'd you come up with that?
they trot out this video of Bill Clinton decrying the terrible messages that this gangster music is sending, and it's like, this is a guy who dropped cruise missiles on pharmaceutical factories in the third world, and he's worried about what gangsters are saying about their girlfriends, and the public's meant to take that seriously.
But that's that. But again, it comes down to what they were intending and what they achieved. Like in such a short period of time, they basically turned America on itself. Do you know what I mean? So everything that America was built on, then comes along this movement. It's like, no, we don't agree with that. Oh, and by the way, thanks for all those years of horrible treatment. You know. Then NWA come out. So they come out at a time where the city's at boiling point, and they're from the city, and they come out and make this music going, hey, we're gonna fly the flag for this. And it stirred the pot like nothing else. This is around Rodney King too.
Yeah.
So, and then the LA
Well, that was
riots.
right in the middle of it,
LA
yeah.
riots, you know. So you learn about that side too. So anyone that says this is just a music doco, it's not. It's cultural history about the time.
It is. There is a point where it just becomes a show about really wealthy people, though.
Oh, I totally agree with that.
Some of whom weren't born wealthy, so it's nice that they've moved on. But like when you see,
They're not going to say anything bad about themselves.
No, but
you know what I mean. They're not going to be like, you know what, I really buggered that up.
Well, there's a big thing in that, like, they've donated $70 million to start this university. I mean, frankly, if you have as
Tax
much money... yeah, exactly. But if you have as much money as Dr. Dre and Jimmy Irvin, if you didn't donate that, you'd be a real... See you next Tuesday.
People be like, oh no, just keep tagging, it's fine.
yeah, funny thing is, like, I know the history of Beats headphones from the point of view of the Koreans who thought they could rip off Dre and ended up getting completely screwed.
Yeah, no,
and it's funny, there is one like 2-second spot in the whole the whole series where they mention Monster Cables and show a picture of the Koreans up on a stage with Jimmy and Dre.
Yeah. I remember that.
And it's like, from their point of view, they invented Beats headphones and got Dre involved. And it could well be Dre was looking for the headphone provider to work with long before that. I can, these things are always two sides.
Well, he was walking on the beach, wasn't he? And he, Jimmy Iovine walking along, good day, Dr. Dre. Got a business idea for you, kind of thing. And then he says 10 minutes later, it was actually happening. Do you know what I mean? But the whole notion that something so huge was created in such a short period of time by these two people, it was the perfect match. It was a guy that had the method and the guy that knew just how to make it work.
But they also had all the artists to put the headphones on.
It's good marketing.
Yeah. And the thing is, any audiophile, boring as they will be, so I don't recommend you ask them yourself, but I have spoken to them, and will tell you there is nothing special about Beats. Yes, they're bass heavy, which is suitable.
I wasn't going to say it first, so I waited for you to diss because it's your podcast, but now I'm going to be like, do that.
Okay, there is nothing special about them. There is certainly nothing that justifies the price. And in fact, the biggest innovation in a set of Beats headphones is the metal weights they put in them to make them feel more substantial than they are.
Well, you see, I use headphones every day, so I know a lot about what they are, because I need to have, obviously, good headphones. And there is a huge difference between what you buy in the shops and then buying, studio quality headphones.
Yeah. You guys on Sennheisers?
No, I've got AKGs. So they're like they're the radio standard, they call them, right? But even listening to my own music, it's like you feel like you're in a theatre, like it's rad. Ooh. But, anyone that's really into music doesn't like Beats headphones. Yeah. So it's just that I know. And they're just like DJs and other people that, are into mixing and studio, they're just like, nah, you kidding? Like, come on. And that's not taking anything away, because everyone's different. But
the weight of them made people think they were a luxury product. They were way bass heavier than other headphones at the time, which, if you're listening to a hell of a lot of music on Interscope, be it the White Guy stuff or or otherwise, it's all beat heavy. Lady Gaga, Marilyn Manson.
That's a good point.
I wonder how much Apple buying Beats was, and I know nothing about this, but whether it was about buying their streaming service, which would at the time have been starting up to be a pretty direct competitor to Apple Music.
Does make sense.
A little bit of a motivator there as well.
I think that the streaming was actually what the $3 billion was about. The streaming and the access to the stars.
The range as well, though. Because the brand became so prominent so quickly. So you put these two brands together, you've got the biggest marketed brand in the world, basically, between, the two companies. So, it was a no-brainer for them. Do I think it's worth $3 billion? I was like,
You do have the issue that Apple's a tech company, so inflating the value of other tech companies by buying them feeds into the perceived value of Apple. Which is why tech companies always buy other tech companies at massively inflated prices. And it's normally paper deals as well, so it's not like Apple would have been backing $3 billion up to Dr. Dre's house. They would have been signing over $3 billion in share certificates in Apple, which he can then sell. So I'm not saying they're not real money, but at the same time, it's a different, slightly different transaction to what it sounds like at first.
If you took two things out of it, I was just thinking this then, if you took two things out of, the 4-part series, what would they be?
I was actually really surprised. I didn't know that story about JJ Fab being part of the reason NWA became so successful. I thought that was quite an interesting bit of history. Yeah. But second thing is just how good they are at marketing themselves, because I did feel like this 4-part series was essentially a bit of a marketing.
You've got to be a good marketer though in music, right?
Yeah. So there was a lot of bias in the story. Oh, yeah. Dre comes off as being this great family man. There's no kind of mention that...
Well, they didn't mention he's been married a great many times, which does imply a great many of those previous marriages came to some sort of conclusion.
No one was sort of mentioning that his ex-wives have taken him for child support. His eldest son died of a heroin overdose.
Well, you can't blame that on a dude.
No, but he was presented as this amazing kind of family man, this tortured genius, but.
You didn't see enough of the actual, this really is my life. This did happen. Yeah. It seemed like hitting the woman they made out as just the only thing he'd ever done.
Exactly, and he's so sorry for it. But there were a lot of
getting in a police chase in your Lamborghini high-speed pursuit, that's not a good thing to do.
Who hasn't done that, mate?
But his contrition about that assault is a little bit hard to take, because there were quotes that he did years after that assault where he was like, who cares? If someone attacks me, I attack them. So, in the face of the Me Too movement, he's become, I'm really sorry for assaulting that woman. I don't know if I buy it.
Lots of happy photos with the wife.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And the mum, she's...
Yeah, but I love the mum's house, and it's like, yeah, I get that Dre would be a real bag of dicks if he didn't buy his mum a nice house.
Well, yeah. Well, you don't want to show her, like, where she had him at 16. It's just like, oh, well, Dre says the money's coming, but it's just been a rough year, you know, like, with all the assault charges and everything. But, yeah, I mean, you're dead right. I mean, I knew more about the actual story, because that's what got me in. So I knew parts of the story, like, serious parts, like the NWA history and all of that, but then... I didn't see any of that because it was all just like it was all sunshine and lollipops. Me and Eazy-E had an argument once about money and Jerry, and then
Well, that and the Eazy-E, it's like, you know, they mentioned that they were all having massive orgies on the weekends, and then they mentioned, oh, Eazy-E died of AIDS, and I'm thinking,
I don't even
were those things related?
Maybe he was just too busy on the music. You know, he missed that lesson. You know,
did they even say what he died of in that documentary?
Yeah, they did mention it was AIDS, but it was very brief. The really dark stuff they kind of just snap over quickly, but they do mention it.
Yeah.
So you got to give them credit for that. It is in there, but they really move adeptly.
Yeah. And one of the DJs was at Groove in the Moon a couple of weekends ago here in Canberra.
Which
Remember that? The DJ Yella, is it?
Okay.
Yeah,
DJ Yella was one of the performers at Groove in the Moon.
Oh.
I missed it because I was having canapes in the VIP tent, but
Yeah.
I heard it was really
It's
good.
where the real action is, isn't it?
I heard it was really good. You can edit that bit out, right?
Sure.
Right. But overall, I mean, you know, and it's part of Netflix at the moment. Everything they do, they're just kicking so many goals.
Oh, I wouldn't say everything they do. I'd say
not everything.
there is an
kicking a lot of
enormous
goals.
amount of very ordinary stuff on Netflix, but there is so much content going in, and it is making it available, and hopefully shows like this are helping people.
Isn't this
find
the argument you two had about who was logging under whose account? And like,
Oh, yeah.
Is that the same guy? Is that I get that
Yeah.
right?
Sheridan got this
I
one.
put
What
that
am I fucking idiot? Oh, John.
I was just getting for a long time
Why
just
is it sending
reality
me the
TV.
Smurfs? Yeah, it is. Something educational.
In fact, if you want to watch something crap, definitely log on to your girlfriend's account.
Sean, how could you? Sorry, that's terrible. Insensitive. But yeah, no, it's they're just kicking a lot of goals. Like there's just so much content that is from all sort of areas. They're not just sort of typecasting themselves.
Well, it's niche
just
suitable.
everything.
So, you know,
Yeah.
you want to watch, not hentai, you want to watch anime, you know,
I
there's
don't think there's any hentai on there.
very nice, that's a different
That might
sort
be
of
a
streaming
little.
service.
There's a very specific
Now
subcategory
you
you're
tell
going to
me.
get into.
That's it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap this segment up, I think. Quickly, how many stars would you give it out of 5?
Oh, me. Oh, look, I did find the just overt bias, and I've watched a lot of things about this era of hip hop. I didn't know much about Jeremy Iovine, that was interesting to me, but I think the overt bias, and it didn't offer a lot of new information for me, so I'm going to say 3.
3.
Ooh. Okay.
I don't do half stars.
No.
though, so-
I was actually going to ask that question. Can you do that?
You
I thought-
can,
you
you
are.
can.
I thought it just might be a little bit like, alright, mate.
That sounds like it was a tacit half star there, though. But
I could have got, if I was doing halves, I could have gone 3.5.
Yeah. Fair play. Look, I really enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it. I agree. I think there was a lot of bias. I don't think we got the full story in parts. But overall, I found it very interesting, and hence I don't really watch many shows where I just go like in one hit. You know what I mean? But that one I had to because I wanted to know more. I'm going to go 4. You said no halves. I probably would have gone 4, maybe 4.5, but no, 4.
okay, I'd give it a solid 4 stars as well. I think if you've got any interest in music over the last 40 years, there's a lot of secret history coming out in this one. Obviously,
And if you're a fan in general.
yeah, but if you're a fan of Lady Gaga, you might actually be really interested to know where the company she keeps, because she doesn't. No one. I mean, Interscope isn't even a label that ever appears on anyone's records, because the actual labels on the.
Because no one buys them
Well,
anymore?
no one buys physical packaging anymore. But even if you did, they wouldn't mention it. The other thing that was really interesting was when they were talking about how just before digital music killed the music industry model, they had this golden period where CDs they could sell for $10 more a copy because everyone thought they were better quality. But because there's no moving parts, they were actually much cheaper than cassettes, and they were just thinking they were.
That's true, I remember that.
Yeah, and no one was pirating then either,
And-
so they were
and
making money hand
Then
over
the
fist.
CD burner came out. Yes.
Yeah.
What a
But
day.
there is an argument, and I got a lot of sympathy to it, that music hasn't, in the mass culture, hasn't really changed much since the late 90s. And the argument is largely because all the money has stopped rolling into the artists the way it was in that period.
Well, I think also Pro Tools and technology changed that as well. Like that It was all, lots of things affected it. But when Pro Tools came in, and it suddenly became like, you know, the software guys got their hats on and just started saying, we can make this for people to do it themselves. That's when it all changed. So it wasn't just like, to record music, you had to go to a studio. That's just what you had to do.
But no one's sitting in their home studio making anything wildly new either.
Oh no, I agree with that absolutely. I totally agree. I don't think we have lasting music anymore. I got asked this question a couple of hours ago. Why are we still talking about the old bands? Because their music was good.
No, but there is plenty of good new music coming out, but they're not doing anything wildly different.
I agree. So what I'm saying is that when it first came out, I was like, whoa, what is this? And that sort of feeling hasn't been around since the early 90s. I personally don't feel, right? During that time.
I think dubstep was the closest thing, and even that I don't think was enough different from other EDM that had gone before it.
Like house and all that kind of stuff, you know? But at the same time, we haven't had a movement like that. Like culturally, you know what I mean? Like technology was changing, the government was awful. You know, all this stuff was happening at once.
Yeah, but technology's still changing and the government's still awful.
No, I know. No, it's true. But like back then this music came out where it was like, that's exactly what's going on. Boom. You know what I mean? So that was it. So
plus everyone's listening to podcasts instead of music.
Also, as well, music is way more accessible now. Like you get it anywhere. You get it on your watch.
Yeah. You
know, so you don't have. You used to all mill around. You know, like, oh wow, get some new batteries for your beatbox, Johnny.
Yeah. Okay, alright, well Billy, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us, and we hope you've enjoyed this segment.
Okay folks, thanks for listening. If you want to contact us with any suggestions, hate mail, love mail, whatever you want, you can contact us on gmtrpodcast@gmail.com.
And we are on Facebook and Twitter, and we also have a YouTube that it gets automatically pushed up if YouTube's your preferred way to consume your audio media. Strange as that might sound. So thanks very much for listening. If this is your first time, hopefully you'll hit the subscribe button. We've just been approved for iTunes. That's very exciting. And if not, we'll be doing this again in a week's time, so hopefully you'll join us again.
See you next week.